Well, hi there everyone, and welcome back to our video series on the minor prophets. And I really hope it's going well for you so far. Well, the last two talks have concentrated on the two prophets who spoke to the 10 tribes that represented the northern kingdom of Israel. That's to say, Amos and Hosea. But now we're going to concentrate on the minor prophets who spoke to the two southern tribes that made up the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, a split between the two kingdoms came about when Solomon died, and the 10 tribes of the north had felt that Solomon had been very unfair on them, had laid upon them a very heavy burden in terms of the labour and material resources that were used to build the temple. And they felt they were discriminated against. So after Solomon's death, the representatives of the 10 northern tribes approached the new king Rehoboam, and they pleaded with him for a lightening of the load. But this was the reply they got from the new king. 1 Kings chapter 12. "My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." Oh dear. So the 10 northern tribes said, "No thank you, we're off." And they broke away to form their own separate nation of Israel. And we're going to put a map up now that will just help you to see the division of the 12 tribes between the 10 of the north. There they are, that's it, that's Israel. And the 2 to the south that we'll be concentrating on in the next few talks, and that's the southern kingdom of Judah. Well, for the 10 northern tribes to respond to King Rehoboam's cruel and crass response by breaking away like they did was surely a mistake. You see, Rehoboam was still part of God's royal line established from David. The first King Jeroboam of Israel was not. And furthermore, the temple in Jerusalem was where God was especially present with his people. And all his people were called upon to worship him there in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, of course, was the capital of Judea. The northern kingdom of Israel had cut itself off from all of this when they broke away. Instead, it built for itself 2 golden calves at its new worship centres. We've seen already how God was angry with the 10 tribes of Israel and what happened as a result. An unbroken line of bad kings oversaw a corrupt, immoral and irreligious country. And with God's final heartfelt plea through Hosea, we saw that last time, didn't we? For them to return to him, it was ignored. The country was then invaded by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the 10 tribes were obliterated. Not completely massacred, many people were led off to Assyria, but the nation state of Israel was no more. The southern kingdom fared a little better, although there was plenty of social and religious sin for our prophets to uncover and expose publicly, as we're going to see. But the outcome for Judah was not obliteration, as it was for Israel, but a severe discipline that God had promised them. They would lose their land through 70 years of exile in Babylon before some were able to return and begin to build up the nation again. So what happened to the southern nation of Judah was not obliteration, but a severe discipline. Well, we learn from the prophet Amos that the Lord does nothing without revealing it first to his prophets. So let's look today at the first of the minor prophets who focused on Judah. His name was Micah. And here's our timeline. Let's put it up now, just to see where Micah fits into the wider scheme of things. You can see that he was a contemporary both of Hosea who we looked at last time, but also of Isaiah, perhaps the greatest of the major prophets, although we're not going to be studying him during this course. Well, let's get into Micah and his book right now. Here's the first heading coming up. It's Introduction. You'll remember when we looked at the prophet Amos, we saw how he was essentially an uneducated man from the country. He came from a country village in Judea. He marched north into Israel to bring a prophecy that exposed their sins and told of God's wrath against their lifestyles. Much of it was just a godly rant, we said. He may not have been as elegant with words as Hosea was, who was an educated man, but he was as brave as a lion, was Amos, and he was filled with the raw emotion and passion of God towards his people as he prophesied against their sin. That was Amos. We encouraged you all to go down to the bottom of your gardens and to read out his prophecy in a loud voice. Then you'll pick up his passion. Now, Micah comes from a similar background, also from the Shephelah district. Now, that's the rural foothills of Judah between the Mediterranean coast in the west and the central hills of Judea, in which you'll find Jerusalem. So that's where they both came from. And like Amos, what he lacks in sophistication, he makes up for in the passion he puts into his prophecies. And again, there are some sections of Micah's book that are best read out at the bottom of your gardens in a loud voice, just as you did with Amos. But Micah is also clever with words, as we'll see, including a clever pun on his own name that we'll find at the very end of the book. You see, Micah's name means, who is there like God? Who is there like God? That's Micah in Hebrew. Another connection with Amos is his concern for social justice and the poor. And we can imagine him growing up in his little village with the evidence of exploitation and corruption by the rich all around him in full view. So how is he going to speak into his country's situation? Well, Micah's book is undoubtedly a series of different sermons spoken at different times, but joined together. And if you read it through from start to finish, it's going to feel a little bit like a kind of a roller coaster ride, up and down. One moment there's anger in the prophecies, and God's word to Judah is woe. But then very soon the mood changes completely, and Micah is prophesying a message of hope. So these 180-degree turns happen several times throughout the book. See how many times you can spot them if you read it through. Now, what's coming out from all of this is the same dilemma for God that we saw when we looked at the book of Hosea. It's between his justice on the one hand and his mercy on the other hand. And happily, Micah's book finishes on a note of mercy, triumphing over judgment, and Micah using his own name in a burst of praise to God. So this is towards the very end of his book. Verse 18 of chapter 7 goes like this. Who is a God like you? That's Micah's name, remember? Who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance. You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. Well, let's break the book down now into two sections as Micah prophesies the future for Judah. We'll call them, first of all, judgment in the near future, and secondly, hope in the far future. So let's look first of all at judgment in the near future. Although Micah is prophesying primarily to his own country, Judah, he begins by directing his prophetic anger against the northern kingdom of Israel. "You started all this," he rants. "You're first to blame for all this trouble in my own country." And he pictures the Lord leaving the temple in Jerusalem and marching down the mountain slopes towards the northern capital of Samaria in Israel. Verse 3 of chapter 1, "Like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope." Well, very shortly after this, the Assyrians were going to invade Israel, and the nation state of Israel would be no more. But Micah's prophesying this. The Lord is coming against you now, like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope. But it's going to affect Judah. "Her wound is incurable. It has come to Judah," we learn in verse 6 of chapter 1. So Israel's sin has spread to Judah like a disease. And first it comes to Jerusalem, the capital. Verse 5. "What is Judah's high place," i.e. the centre of pagan idolatry? "Is it not Jerusalem?" And then it spreads out to the towns and villages where Micah lived, much to his deep despair. Verse 8. "Because of this, I will weep and wail. I will go about barefoot and naked. I will howl like a jackal and moan like an owl." Now, let's just pause for a second, shall we, before we go any further. Let's just consider the depth of Micah's feeling about his country that has lost its godliness. He wept and he wailed. He went about barefoot and naked. He howled like a jackal and he moaned like an owl. Now, the commentator John Blanchard, who we've met before, challenges us about equivalent events today. Let's just put this quote up. "Is there the same kind of heartbroken concern amongst God's people today? How do we react when we read of the latest financial scandal, rising crime figures, an escalating divorce rate, or some other disaster in society? What do we think when a Christian leader has a moral lapse, or fellow believers begin to show signs of losing their love for the things of God, or make a shipwreck of their faith? Do we climb up to the judge's bench, or fall down at the mourner's bench?" John Blanchard giving us food for thought there. Well, with the contagion of sin now rife in Micah's local towns, he now pronounces judgment on the places around him. But he does so in a very unusual way. He takes each name and pronounces a judgment that fits with the name. Let's just take two examples so you can see what I mean. There are others. So the town of Beth Ophrah means house of dust. And so Micah prophesies that its inhabitants will roll in the dust. Verse 10 of chapter 1. Then the town of Zanan means come out. And so Micah prophesies a disaster upon the town, possibly a future invasion, which means its inhabitants will not come out. Verse 11 of chapter 1, but stay in their houses. Well, I wondered how that would work today. So I consulted a map of Norfolk and to see if I could come up with an equivalent approach. Here's just two examples. How about Fakenham? I can see that your religion is completely fake. Or how about Thetford, meaning the People's Ford? I will flood your town, Thetford, so that people can no longer cross this river. Well, I made those last two up, but you get the idea. That was Micah's novel approach of prophesying God's judgment upon his surrounding towns. Well, the remaining sections of Micah's book, which major on God's judgment on Judah, cover familiar ground to anyone who's studied Amos or Hosea. So he observed bribery among the judges and the prophets and the priests. The very people who were meant to uphold the law of God were being paid to say the things that the people just wanted to hear. So here's an example from chapter 3, verse 11. Her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortunes for money. Everyone is a slave to money. Then we read about the exploitation of the powerless. We read about covetousness and greed and cheating and violence and cruelty. Social and political power were being used to line pockets, and the social structure of the country was breaking down. Let's just get a small glimpse of Micah's feelings towards what's going on around him. So this is reading from chapter 7, the first 3 verses. What misery is mine! I am like one who gathers summer fruit at the gleaning of the vineyard. There is no cluster of grapes to eat, none of the early figs that I crave. The faithful have been swept from the land. Not one upright person remains. Everyone lies in wait to shed blood. They hunt each other with nets. Both hands are skilled in doing evil. The ruler demands gifts. The judge accepts bribes. The powerful dictate what they desire. They all conspire together. Micah just bewailing the state of his country. Then in chapter 6, Micah presents the case against Judah in a different, quite imaginative way. So he presents us here with a courtroom scene in which God is the prosecutor and is bringing his case against Judah, with the mountain and the hills, the mountains and the hills of Judah, who've seen it all, acting as his jury. Very imaginative, isn't it? So rather than hammering Judah with a list of their sins, God the prosecutor simply asks the question, why? Why are you treating me like this? So this is verses 3 to 5 of Micah 6. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. In other words, Judah, I have led you to this place, the promised land, and I've protected you and I've blessed you. So why are you behaving like this? You know, mountains and hills, you're the witness to all this. Why are these people treating me like this? Complains the Lord. Now, the defendant Judah then responds with an offer of more sacrifices to Yahweh in an attempt to make things all right. Thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil, my firstborn child even. That's a practice they learned from the worshippers of Molech, the demon god. No, 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 says God. And what follows is perhaps the most well-known verse in the whole of the book of Micah. I don't want any of that stuff. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. That's it, guys. Pleasing God and living right are not complicated, are they? And that verse just sums up in a nutshell what it means today to be a lover of God, to be a follower of Jesus, and to be a host to the Holy Spirit. Micah's words ring out across the centuries to us here today. Now, before we leave this section, Let's look at the first of two amazingly precise predictions about places that Micah made in this book. And the first concerned the fate of the Judeans if they ignored God's warnings to them. What would happen if they took no notice of these prophetic warnings? Well, chapter 4, verse 10. Writhe in agony, daughter Zion, like a woman in labour. For now you must leave the city to camp in an open field. You will go to Babylon. Now, Babylon there was just a non-entity on the map. No one had heard of it. But Micah picks it out. He sees what's going to happen in the future. You will go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you out of the hand of your enemies. Which of course he did after 70 years there. So yes, the Lord has a plan for his people, even if the surrounding nations can't see it. It's not to be obliterated like the northern kingdom, but it's to be exiled to Babylon and eventually to be rescued. And Micah saw it all. Well, let's move on now to Micah's prophecies of hope for the future. First of all, the far future. So let's look at his hope in the far future. That's the next heading. There are two predictions about the future in Micah. One in the far future, just over 700 years away from his time. And the second one is so far into the future that it hasn't happened yet. It goes beyond where we are today. So let's look at these two amazing future predictions that you'll see in Micah. So prediction number one is the second amazingly precise prediction about a place. The first one was Babylon. This is the second amazing prediction about a place. So Micah foresees tremendous significance for a small town in the hill country of Judah. This is verses 2 to 5 of chapter 5. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who is ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labour bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. And he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. Well, let's just get a commentary here from John Blanchard. It is impossible to miss the fulfillment of this prophecy in the life and ministry of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. But this event was still 700 years away from Micah's day, and Judah had many ups and downs to go through before then. Well, Galatians 4 verse 5 talks about, after 700 years, the time had fully come when God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. And of course that happened in the little village of Bethlehem. And Micah foresaw that 700 years before. Amazing. Well, that's the first prediction. And that, of course, has already happened. That's been fulfilled. Here's the second prediction that I think we'll all agree has yet to happen. Let me read verses 2 to 7 from Micah chapter 4. Coming up on the screen now. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. And they will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war any more. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. All the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord, our God, for ever and ever. So what period in the future does this return to? And I have to say there's some disagreement amongst my commentators as to the answer to that question. Is it a millennium age after the return of Jesus? Is it a glorious future age for the church before Jesus' return? Well, my view is that I see this as an early prophetic glimpse of Revelation chapter 21. Let me just read out verses 2 to 4. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, behold, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And this is the ultimate hope, isn't it, for us Christians today, that one day we will all be together in a newly restored world, without sin, but with our God. For the Judeans of Micah's day, these words were the ultimate expression of the character of God. The God who judges sin, yes, because he is just and righteous, but also the God who longs for the company of a righteous people to be with him in a sinless world forever. And this can happen because, as Micah saw, God has a plan. A plan. And it was a plan that would take his people through Babylon, through Bethlehem, through Calvary, through Pentecost, through the return of Jesus, and finally to the new Jerusalem, the capital city of our eternal resting place, where, as we've seen, let's just hear it again, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war any more. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. So, let's hear again Micah's conclusion to his book. Who is a God like you? That's Micah's name, of course. Who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance. Who is a God like you? And we're learning, aren't we, as we read through the minor prophets, just what the character of God is like. We're hearing all about the way in which God is good. God is a God of justice, a God who judges because he's good, but also a God full of mercy, who longs for his people to return back to him. That's why we're studying these books. This is what our God is like, and it's coming out in the minor prophets. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. What's the takeaway from this? What's the kind of the one thing, if nothing else, that you take away from this study of Micah? Well, I think it's very simple, really, from this book. Let's all now do justice. Let's love kindness, shall we? And let's all walk humbly with our God. And that's Christianity. Well, next time we're going to look at the prophet Joel. So in the meantime, God bless you all. Thanks for listening.